Imagine a blade so perfectly curved that it could slice through a man's neck in a single motion. Yet most historians believed it was too fragile to exist. The ancient world's deadliest weapons weren't the massive swords you see in movies. They were elegant, curved, and designed with a mathematical precision that modern scientists are only now beginning to understand. But the world of ancient curved blades holds far more than romantic tales of samurai honor or Arabian Nights. These weapons were forged in the fires of necessity, born from the blood of 1,000 battles, each curve calculated to maximize cutting power while minimizing weight. Some were buried with kings who conquered empires. Others were considered so sacred that touching them meant death. And a few designs were so lethal they were banned by the very armies that created them. Here's what sounds like legend but is carved into archaeological fact. A single curved blade excavated from a Parthian tomb could still slice through modern ballistic gel after 2,000 years. Another, found in the ruins of Damascus, had a molecular structure that metallurgists couldn't replicate until 2006. These weren't just weapons. They were technological marvels wrapped in mystery and soaked in the blood of history's most feared warriors. Today, we'll uncover 8 of the most devastating curved blades ever forged, each one more ingenious than the last. And the first one? It revolutionized warfare in a way that still influences sword design today. Blade 1. The copesh, Egypt's sickle of death. The bronze glints in the desert sun as Pharaoh Ramesses II raises his arm. In his hand, a weapon that looks more like a farming tool than an instrument of war. But that strange, sickle-like curve? It's about to change the battlefield forever. The copesh wasn't just Egypt's most iconic weapon. It was a psychological nightmare for their enemies. Picture this. You're a Hittite soldier, shield raised, ready for a straight sword thrust. But the Egyptian warrior doesn't thrust. Instead, his blade curves around your shield, the hooked end catching your neck from an angle you never trained to defend. That's the genius of the copesh. It made traditional defensive techniques obsolete overnight. But here's where it gets fascinating. The kopesh's curve wasn't arbitrary. It was based on the lunar crescent, a sacred symbol to the Egyptians. They believed the weapon channeled the power of the moon goddess Khonsu. Superstition? Maybe. But when archaeologists analyzed the metallurgy, they found something remarkable. The outer edge was harder than the inner curve, creating a natural reinforcement that prevented the blade from bending during that devastating hooking motion. And this wasn't a weapon for common soldiers. Oh no, the copesh was a status symbol, reserved for pharaohs, generals, and elite warriors. King Tutankhamun was buried with 2 of them. One was purely ceremonial, covered in gold. But the other? It showed clear signs of combat use. That teenage king had actually fought with it. Now, you might think a curved blade would be weaker than a straight sword. The Egyptians thought so too, until they discovered something during the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. When their straight bronze swords shattered against Hittite armor, the kopesh's curve distributed the impact force differently. Instead of meeting resistance head-on, the blade slid while cutting, like a modern chef's knife slicing through meat. This wasn't just a weapon. It was applied physics centuries before physics was even a discipline. But the copesh had a dark limitation that would eventually doom it. An understanding that flaw reveals why the next blade on our list became the dominant design across 3 continents. Blade 2. The falcata, Iberia's forward-curving terror. The year is 218 BC. Hannibal's army stands at the gates of Rome, and Roman soldiers are about to face a weapon so devastating that they'll spend the next century trying to replicate it. The Iberian mercenaries step forward, and in their hands is something the Romans have never seen. A blade that curves forward instead of back. This is the falcata, and it represents a complete reimagining of what a sword could be. While the copesh hooked around defenses, the falcata did something far more brutal. It amplified cutting power through sheer geometric brilliance. That forward curve? It wasn't decorative. It placed the center of mass toward the tip, creating what modern physicists call distal taper inversion. In simple terms, when you swung this blade, it hit like a sword but cut like an axe. Roman historians recorded something that sounds like exaggeration but has been verified by modern testing. A single falcata strike could cut through a Roman helmet, skull, and neck in one motion. The Roman general Titus Livius wrote of Iberian warriors decapitating armored cavalry with downward strikes. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as propaganda. Then metallurgists tested replica falcatas against period-accurate Roman armor. The ancient sources were telling the truth. But here's the secret that made the falcata truly special. Iberian smiths understood differential hardening 2,000 years before the Japanese perfected it in katanas. They would heat-treat the spine of the blade differently from the edge, creating a weapon that was flexible enough to absorb impact but hard enough to hold a razor edge. One falcata found near Toledo had a hardness gradient that modern bladesmiths call impossibly precise for ancient forge technology. And the Romans? They were so impressed and terrified that they began recruiting Iberian swordsmen exclusively for their gladiatorial games. Not as victims, as premium entertainment. A single Iberian gladiator with a falcata could command prices 10 times higher than a standard fighter. The weapon's reputation was that fearsome. Now, the falcata dominated the Western Mediterranean, but far to the east, another curved blade was being perfected, one that would become synonymous with an empire that stretched from Vienna to the gates of India. But this blade had a secret even deadlier than its curve. Blade 3, the scimitar, the curved soul of the Islamic empires. Damascus, 800 AD. A swordsmith named Ahmed al-Andalusi pulls a glowing blade from his forge. As it cools, patterns appear on the steel, flowing waves like water frozen in metal. This isn't decoration. It's the signature of what will become history's most legendary sword steel, Damascus steel. And the blade? A scimitar that will influence warfare from Spain to Indonesia for the next 1,000 years. But let's clear up the biggest myth first. Scimitar isn't actually a specific sword. It's a European catch-all term for dozens of different curved Islamic blades. The shamshir, the saif, the kilij, the talwa. Each had its own purpose, its own geometry, its own soul. But they all shared one revolutionary design principle. A curve that made them devastating from horseback. Here's why that matters. Most armies in the ancient world fought on foot. But the Islamic empires perfected cavalry warfare, and when you're fighting from a horse, a straight sword has a fatal flaw. You can only thrust forward, and if you miss, you've ridden past your enemy before you can strike again. But a curved blade? You can slash in a wide arc as you ride past, and that curve naturally draws the edge across your target. It's the same principle as a modern saber cut. The curve transforms your horse's momentum into cutting force. But the scimitar's real magic was in the steel itself. Damascus steel, or more accurately, wood steel forged using patterns from Damascus, contained carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires. Yes, you heard that right. Nanotechnology in medieval swords. Modern materials scientists only identified these structures in 2006. The ancient smiths didn't understand the chemistry, but they perfected the technique through generations of trial, error, and closely guarded secrets. And this steel could do something that seems impossible. It could cut through European broadswords. Not just chip them, cut through them. Crusader chronicles are filled with accounts of Islamic warriors slicing clean through Christian swords during combat. For centuries, Europeans thought these were tall tales. Then modern metallurgists tested it. A properly forged Damascus blade can absolutely shear through softer European steel because of those carbon structures we just mentioned. But here's the tragedy. The secret of making true Damascus steel was lost sometime in the 1700s. Even today, with all our modern technology, we can't perfectly replicate the original process. We can get close, but something's missing, some technique, some temperature, some timing that died with the last master smiths. Still, the scimitar's influence didn't die. It spread east along the Silk Road, and in Japan, swordsmiths were watching, learning, and preparing to create what many consider the ultimate curved blade. Blade 4, the katana, Japan's soul-cutting masterpiece. Kamakura, 1232 AD. A samurai named Goro Nudo Masamune heats and folds steel for the 73rd time. He's not making a weapon, he's performing a religious ritual. Because in Japan, the katana isn't just a sword. It's the physical manifestation of a warrior's soul. And the curve in that blade? It's the result of a metallurgical miracle that turns a single piece of steel into two materials at once. The katana's curve isn't forged, it's born during the quenching process. Here's how. The smith coats the blade's spine with a thick layer of clay but leaves the edge almost bare. When the glowing blade is plunged into water, the thin edge cools rapidly and contracts, while the thick spine cools slowly. This differential cooling creates tremendous internal stress, and that stress bends the blade into its iconic curve. But more importantly, it creates two different types of steel in one blade. Hard, brittle martensite on the edge for cutting, and flexible pearlite in the spine for shock absorption. This is why katanas could do something European swords couldn't. They could cut through bodies without chipping or breaking. The hard edge would slice through bone, while the flexible spine would absorb the impact shock. It's the same engineering principle as a modern suspension bridge. Rigid where you need strength, flexible where you need to absorb force. But here's what makes the katana truly unique. The Japanese developed an aesthetic philosophy around sword testing. They called it tamashigiri, and it was horrifyingly specific. Swords were rated by how many bodies they could cut through in a single stroke. Not just any bodies. The testing used executed criminals, and the cuts had specific names. Rotsubarai meant cutting through both hips. Sutsunomi meant cutting through the torso at shoulder level. The record? 7 bodies in one cut, achieved with a blade forged by Muramasa in 1556. Now, before you think this is just Japanese efficiency, understand that sword testing was deeply spiritual. The samurai believed a properly forged blade could cut through more than flesh. It could sever karma, cut through illusion, slice away the false self. This is why when a samurai committed seppuku, the choice of sword was as important as the ritual itself. The blade had to be pure enough to release the soul cleanly. But the katana had a weakness that's rarely discussed. That beautiful curve? It made the blade phenomenal for cutting but terrible for thrusting. You couldn't stab through armor effectively. This is why when Portuguese traders arrived with European rapiers in the 1540s, some Japanese swordsmen began adopting straight blades for armor piercing. The katana was perfect for unarmored duels but less effective against heavy armor. However, far to the south, in the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia, weaponsmiths were perfecting a curved blade that solved this problem in the most unexpected way. Blade 5, the kopis, Greece's forward-slashing assassin. Athens, 450 BC. The phalanx has broken. Shields are splintering. And in the chaos of close-quarters combat, Greek hoplites drop their long spears and draw a secondary weapon that most people have never heard of. A blade that looks like it was designed by someone who studied the physics of butchery. Meet the kopis, Greece's answer to the falcata, but older, meaner, and designed for one specific purpose: to cut through the gap between a helmet and shoulder armor. That forward curve? It wasn't for show. It was a killing angle. Here's what made the kopis revolutionary. Greek warfare was dominated by the phalanx, where soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder with long spears. But when formations collapsed, you needed something for close combat. A straight sword was fine, but it couldn't generate enough force in cramped quarters. The kopis solved this through what modern knife makers call belly on the blade, that bulging forward curve that moves the center of percussion toward the tip. Think of it this way: when you chop with a straight blade, the force is distributed along the edge. But when you chop with the kopis, all that force concentrates at a single point where the curve is most pronounced. It's the same reason why a modern kukri machete can cut through small trees. The weight and curve combine to create devastating chopping power. But here's the detail that historians missed for centuries. The kopis wasn't a sword at all, not in the traditional sense. It was a tool adapted for war. The shape is nearly identical to ancient Greek farming implements used for harvesting. When farmers were conscripted into the army, they already knew how to swing this type of blade. The kopis represented a brilliant piece of military pragmatism. Give soldiers a weapon that requires no training because they've been using the same motion since childhood. And Greek mercenaries who fought in Persia brought the kopis east, where it influenced Persian blade design, which influenced Indian blade design, which eventually influenced the Southeast Asian blades we'll discuss next. But the Greeks themselves were learning from others too. Archaeological evidence suggests the kopis design was borrowed from Etruscan blades, which were borrowed from Iberian designs, which might trace back to Bronze Age Minoans. Every culture was stealing and improving everyone else's innovations. But the kopis had one unique advantage over every blade we've discussed so far. It was cheap to make. The simple forward curve meant less complex forging, less folding, less specialized metallurgy. A competent smith could produce 10 kopis in the time it took to make one katana. This meant Greek cities could arm citizen soldier militias quickly during times of war. Democracy and mass-produced weaponry emerged together in Athens, and that's not a coincidence. Yet for all its effectiveness, the kopis faded from history when Rome conquered Greece and standardized military equipment. But the design survived in one place, transformed into a blade that would become synonymous with rebellion and revolution. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. Blade 6, the showel, Ethiopia's shield-bypassing hook. Axum, 500 AD. An Ethiopian warrior faces an enemy behind a massive shield. A straight sword is useless. The shield's too large. A spear? Too easy to deflect. But then the warrior draws a blade that curves so dramatically it looks more like a sickle than a sword. And in one fluid motion, he reaches around the shield and stabs his opponent from an angle that should be impossible. This is the showel, and it represents the most extreme curve on any combat blade in history. That semicircular bend? It measures nearly 90 degrees at its apex. This thing looks like it should be decorative, like it shouldn't work as a weapon at all. But it was devastating, and here's why. The showel completely bypassed the fundamental principle of shield defense. Every shield defense in ancient warfare relied on one assumption. Attacks come from the front. You block, parry, or deflect incoming strikes that travel in straight lines or gentle arcs. But the showel's extreme curve meant Ethiopian warriors could hook around defenses and strike from the side while standing directly in front of their opponent. It was a geometry hack, exploiting a blind spot that existed in every shield-based fighting style from Rome to Persia. But the showel wasn't just a shield bypasser. It was also a slashing weapon when used correctly. That extreme curve? When you drew it across an unarmored target, the blade folded around the body part, almost wrapping it. The result was wounds so deep and devastating that ancient accounts describe single showel cuts severing limbs completely. The curve literally hugged the target as it sliced. Here's what makes this even more impressive. Ethiopia never had access to high-quality iron ore. While Damascus was producing legendary steel, Ethiopian smiths were working with bog iron and recycled materials. Yet they created a blade design so effective it compensated for inferior metallurgy through pure geometric innovation. The showel proves that brilliant design can overcome material limitations. And Ethiopian warriors used the showel in pairs, one in each hand. This technique, called double showel fighting, was so dangerous that only elite guards were trained in it. Why? Because the curve made the blades incredibly difficult to control. Swing too wildly, and you'd cut yourself. But master the technique, and you became a whirlwind of hooks and slashes that no conventional defense could stop. The showel survived into the 20th century, used during Ethiopia's resistance against Italian invasion in the 1930s. Italian soldiers, armed with modern rifles, reported facing Ethiopian warriors who charged with showels, hooks around Italian bayonets, and stabbed from impossible angles. Even outdated by centuries, the design was still effective. But as devastating as the showel was, another African blade was being perfected to the west. One designed not to bypass shields, but to cut through them entirely. Blade 7, the mambele, West Africa's multi-bladed mystery. Central Africa, 1300 AD. A Mangbetu warrior holds a weapon that defies every convention of sword design we've discussed. It has multiple curves, multiple blades, multiple points, and no one, not even modern weapons historians, fully understands all the ways it was used in combat. This is the mambele, and it's proof that curved blades evolved in radically different directions depending on local warfare needs. The mambele looks like someone took 3 different weapons and fused them into one piece of iron. The main blade curves forward like a kopis. But then there's a secondary hooked projection that curves backward like a copesh. And then, on some versions, additional spikes, and blades jutting at odd angles. It looks chaotic, but every curve, every projection, had a purpose. Here's what we know. The mambele was a dual-purpose weapon. It could be used in hand-to-hand combat, but it was also balanced for throwing. Yes, throwing. That complex shape that looks aerodynamically disastrous was actually carefully balanced so that when thrown, it would tumble through the air, presenting different cutting edges with each rotation. An enemy couldn't predict which part would hit them, the forward curve, the hooked projection, or one of the spikes. It was like throwing a helicopter made of knives. And in close combat, that multicurve design meant a mambele fighter had options. You could hook with one curve, slash with another, thrust with the spike, all without changing your grip. European fencing masters talk about forte and foible, strong and weak parts of a blade. The mambele had 4 or 5 different strong points, making it unpredictable in duels. But here's the really fascinating part. Mambele designs varied drastically between tribes, sometimes between individual smiths. Unlike the katana or scimitar, which had relatively standardized forms, the mambele was deeply personal. A warrior's blade was custom forged to match his fighting style, his arm length, his throwing preference. Some mambeles had curves that spiraled nearly 180 degrees. Others were relatively straight with small hooks. This wasn't mass production. This was bespoke weapon crafting. And the metallurgy? West African smiths were using bloomery furnaces to create steel that British metallurgists in 1800s couldn't identify. When Europeans first acquired mambeles, they assumed they were decorative because the forging techniques seemed too advanced for primitive cultures. Turned out, West African smiths had been producing high-carbon steel for centuries. They just hadn't written treatises about it. The mambele fell out of use during colonial periods, dismissed as primitive by European powers who didn't understand its sophistication. But a few examples survived in museums, and when modern martial artists began studying them, they discovered the designs contained biomechanical principles that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century. These weren't crude weapons. They were highly evolved tools shaped by hundreds of years of combat experience. Yet for all the mambele's versatility, one curved blade surpassed them all in terms of sheer terror and psychological impact. A weapon so infamous that its very name became synonymous with bloodshed. Blade 8, the kilij, the Ottoman Empire's ultimate cavalry saber. Constantinople, 1453 AD. Ottoman cavalry thunder toward Byzantine walls, and in their hands is a blade that represents the culmination of 1,000 years of curved sword evolution. The kilij, a Turkish saber with a profile so perfectly engineered for horseback combat that it would dominate battlefields from Hungary to Yemen for the next 4 centuries. The kilij looks like a scimitar, but that comparison does it injustice. Every element of this blade was mathematically optimized for one purpose: to deliver devastating slashing cuts from a galloping horse. That curve isn't uniform, it increases dramatically near the tip, creating what bladesmiths call a yeoman, a flared, wider section at the end. This wasn't decoration. This was engineering genius. Here's why the yeoman matters. When you slash with a curved sword, the tip moves faster than the base because of the arc of motion. But speed alone doesn't cut. You need weight. The yeoman added mass precisely where the blade moved fastest, combining velocity and weight at the impact point. The result? Ottoman cavalry could deliver cuts with such force that chroniclers recorded kilij strikes severing armored arms at the shoulder. But the kilij had another advantage rarely discussed. It was a draw-cut specialist. When an Ottoman cavalryman rode past an enemy, he didn't just slash. He drew the blade across the target as he swung, essentially sawing through armor and flesh simultaneously. The curve of the blade naturally facilitated this slicing motion. European straight sabers hit and bounced off. The kilij hit and pulled through the target. And the Ottomans understood psychological warfare. The kilij wasn't just effective, it looked terrifying. That sweeping curve, the gleaming steel, the ornate hilt, all contributed to an image of Ottoman military might. When janissaries marched into battle with kilijs at their sides, enemies knew they faced an empire that had perfected the art of war. The weapon became a symbol of Ottoman power, appearing in paintings, poems, and political propaganda. But here's the secret that made Ottoman kilijs superior even to earlier Islamic scimitars. Turkish smiths developed a specific quenching technique using water mixed with sheep fat. This created a blade that was harder than Damascus steel at the edge but more flexible in the spine. Modern metallurgical analysis shows Ottoman kilij had a Rockwell hardness gradient that's considered near-perfect for a cavalry saber. They had, through experimentation, achieved what modern smiths do with computer modeling. The kilij's dominance lasted until firearms made cavalry charges obsolete. But even then, Ottoman officers continued carrying kilijs into the early 20th century, not as practical weapons but as symbols of warrior tradition. The last kilij used in actual combat was probably during the Turkish War of Independence in the 1920s, a 1,000-year-old design still relevant in the age of machine guns. And that brings us full circle, back to the beginning of our journey through these 8 curved blades. From the kopesh's hook to the kilij's draw-cut perfection, we've seen how different cultures independently discovered that curves create cutting power. The copesh hooked around shields. The falcata amplified force through geometry. The scimitar transformed cavalry warfare. The katana became a spiritual object. The kopis brought butchery to the battlefield. The showel bent reality itself. The mambele defied categorization. And the kilij perfected everything that came before. These weren't just weapons. They were technological marvels, each representing generations of trial, error, bloodshed, and innovation. They were forged by cultures that understood that a blade's curve could mean the difference between conquest and collapse, between life and death, between empire and extinction. If you enjoyed this journey through history's deadliest curved blades, please subscribe to see more deep dives into ancient warfare and forgotten technology.